trick or a ploy by the anti-war movement, which it was in some degree. But so he kind of cut the difference, and he planted a tree on the White House lawn, Nixon, and you could see him with a perfect suit on, and instead of him having the shovel, he has his wife, Pat Nixon, in high heels, lifting the earth to put in one tree. But yet, after that first Earth Day, Nixon gave the employees of the Interior Department the day off, and then that summer, Nixon green lights and creates the Environmental Protection Agency. And by the end of 1970, William Ruckelshaus becomes the head of the environmental EPA, and we starting to top it all off in 1970, that Earth Day year, we have the Clean Air Act of 1970, the toughest environmental regulations. There you go. And it's Nixon. Now, I got to ask William Ruckelshaus, the first head of the EPA, brilliant lawyer. I did the oral history of Ruckelshaus for Washington State and University of Washington combined. And Ruckelshaus was getting very senior and he wrote the founding document of the EPA, legal language, and with a kind of mystic nature writing about beauty and wilderness and John Muir-like writing. But anyway, he wrote the founding document, but he never remembered what the boss said, Nixon said about it. Never could know what the boss said. So he went and dug into files to see there must have been a reaction from the president. It was so hurly-burly. And there's the document of the founding of the EPA, the memo, and there's Nixon, the president's handwriting, along these beautiful legal/nature writing points where Nixon wrote bullshit by Ruckelshaus's writing. Nixon was a politician that recognized the American people were demanding the environment, that Ed Muskie was hobby horsing that to run for the president in 1972, and that Nixon, with the advice of John Ehrlichman, who was a Seattle land-based lawyer, most known for Watergate, but actually was an environmental lawyer running domestic affairs, and people like Russell Train and others, Nixon jumped into the environmental game. I say this, there's hope of bipartisanism to come when we're trying to make and heal our planet. But what I came to first mention is I just wrote a book. It'll be out in November. It's up on Amazon now, called Silent Spring Revolution, which covers really environment from 1945 to 1973. 45, Hiroshima. 73 in December, the Endangered Species Act. And that same December of 73, not one senator was opposed to the Environmental Protection Act. Not one. But at the same time, we had in October of 73 the energy crisis, the Arab oil embargo, high gasoline prices, inflation, and it started making people want to back off. They started passing the Alaska pipeline and this project anything because energy had taken over by 74, where Nixon has to resign of Watergate, as a bigger concern nationally than the environment. And I begin my book, although I write about John Kennedy's life and the Kennedy family, but I thought I'd tell you some of the environmental heroes of my book. And one of the big things is we forget how close atomic fallout is to the environmental movement. Hiroshima and Nagasaki shocked people. Not only did the world change overnight, but John Hershey of the New Yorker famously showed photographs of people's skin melting in Japan and the horror of radiation sickness. And people like William O. Douglas, Supreme Court Justice, thought it was immoral to drop a bomb on Nagasaki. There were some Catholic leaders that opposed it. John F. Kennedy's father wanted to see Truman and tell him not to ever drop another one of those bombs. But we kept blowing up nuclear weapons willy-nilly after World War II in the Nevada test range, one after the other, hundreds, thousands bombs blowing up, radiation from the Marshall Islands and into the whole Southwest. And you can't deal with the Frank Church and environmentalism in the 60s without realizing that that anti-nuclear testing movement gained a lot of currency. Even now when we look at the Ukraine and you look at that blanket, that landscape, and we're looking at Chernobyl, and God forbid what would happen if somebody bombed there, and and so in the 1950s, it was from 1945, Hiroshima, to Jack Kennedy's inauguration, conservation was kind of not in. Theodore Roosevelt loved conservation, FDR loved conservation, but Truman and Eisenhower didn't care a lot about it. And it was a fallow, slow period, but slowly this anti-nuke testing movement grew. And the big figure in my book is Barry Commoner, who some of you may know or not know, but he started doing tests on baby teeth to see which children were getting sick in America from the fallout. If you studied the teeth, he was running at Washington University and he was a great scientist, Commoner, and came public as a public scientist showing how humans were getting sick from radiation fallout. And others joined him. Most famously, a man I don't think any of you have heard for a long time mentioned, Dr. Albert Schweitzer, a Nobel Prize winner in Gabon of French Equatorial Africa, who was taking care of people as a doctor that had leprosy and the like. And the editor of the Saturday Review went to Africa and convinced Dr. Schweitzer, the Nobel winner, to go on Oslo radio and announce to the world that nuclear testing had to stop, that it was going to destroy the planet. And then Norman Cousins becomes John F. Kennedy's big messenger when Kennedy is president in 1963. After the trauma of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy signs the historic nuclear test ban treaty, stopping the testing with Russia and Great Britain of no atomic weapons testing in the atmosphere or underwater. So from 45 to 63, it wasn't celebrated as an environmental thing as much as it was a public health scare. And the reason I mention that so much, the anti-nuclear testing, it segues in that movement to Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring Revolution in 1962, a book as seismic as affecting culture as was the Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Rachel Carson grew up along the Allegheny River in Pennsylvania. She went to Chatham's, a women's college. She started majoring in zoology for her master's at Johns Hopkins. But she worked at Woods Hole. How many people here know Woods Hole? Crucial. It's just down the road from where the Kennedy compound is and right next to where the Kennedys were. And she studied at Woods Hole, which was the great place for studying marine ecosystems. Rachel Carson started writing articles for the Baltimore Sun on shad populations or on mackerel and all different kinds of things. And Rachel Carson started studying the sea. And in the 1940s and 50s, she wrote an incredible trilogy about our oceans. And if you haven't read her ocean writings, do. You can now get it in a handsome Library of America volume that just came out with all three of these. And when I'm saying popular, bestseller, #1, Rachel Carson, #1, there became a huge interest in the oceans after World War II. I wrote a book recently on John F. Kennedy and the moon called American Moonshot, but Kennedy was just as deep into oceanography and studying of our oceans. And Carson became a bit of a muse for John F. Kennedy. In fact, Rachel Carson started getting information about another environmental threat that emerged after World War II. Besides nuclear radiation, DDT, pesticides. And she got insider information like a reporter from U.S. Fish and Wildlife on how fish and birds were dying and getting sick from DDT. And she started writing the book Silent Spring. And why Rachel Carson is a revolution is her book in '62 when it came out. Not only was it controversial, the New Yorker ran it in excerpts and all of this, but Rachel Carson was saying your kid and your kid and your kid is getting sick playing in their backyard. That it's public health. That in good environmental protection is about health. Up until Rachel Carson in conservation, it was a lot about saving grand places. You know, the geysers at Yellowstone, or the redwood trees, or or even the Everglades. But she's saying, whether you want to call yourself an environmentalist or not, you better wake up because you're getting sick. And what she's attacking is the chemical industry after World War II that was unregulated. Remember, I just said the EPA is not created till 1970, so there wasn't a lot of regulations going on. We were spraying crop dusters of poison. Where we were going, people were there was no way to even have a warning label on all of these different types of chemicals. So Carson kicks things into high gear. And at that point, you started getting a lot of people in the U.S. Senate, including Frank Church, who became determined to make the environment or environmental concerns or new conservation a top-tier political discussion point. So it's DDT, anti-DDT. Eventually, DDT gets banned in 1972 in North America. There's a big, nuclear fallout, which I just told you with the, that's good. The nuclear fallout issues, but it all started gelling together under John F. Kennedy. I would say the new frontier of Kennedy promoted conservation like nobody's business, and he embraced Rachel Carson. It's the epitome of leadership. At a press conference, they asked John Kennedy, what do you think of these pesticides being bad? And he said, I've read Miss Carson, and we'll find out. We're going to investigate. And he hired a presidential scientific committee to give the facts, and it came in that Rachel Carson had told the truth, and our government moved in the right direction because of that. But where Frank Church comes in is less on DDT, less on nuclear fallout. Where he comes in big eventually is on the wilderness issue. And as you all know, wilderness is one beautiful idea. It's signed by Lyndon Johnson in the law, but you might as well call the Wilderness Act the Frank Church Act. In 1935, a group called the Wilderness Society started saying roads are what bring in havoc in the natural world. If you ban roads in a natural area, you'll have a pristine wilderness. So it was promoting roadless wilderness, and it got Hubert Humphrey originally is the one who proposed it. But Frank Church picked it up and led the committee, led pushing the Wilderness Society, has the most beautiful writings about wilderness of any senator of that era. And I'm proud to say that Boise State and the Frank Church Institute has been taking on, doing oral histories about the history of the Wilderness Act. And you know in Idaho how important wilderness is and how important it is to Church's legacy. This is a brave thing, guys, for a Idaho senator talking about turning his back on extraction industries and agriculture and timber to say, let's leave big, vast million acres alone. That's brave. If you said that from New York, it may not be that brave. You're saying it from the West. And Church was a great friend of John F. Kennedy. If I talk about who are the new frontier people, Jack Kennedy senators, I put Frank Church right up there. His course, along with brother Ted Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. There are other senators I write about in my book, Scoop Jackson, who are important. But Church is crucial. And Kennedy also promotes national seashores, public beaches. Kennedy creates Cape Cod National Seashore, Point Reyes out in San Francisco, Padre Island in Texas. And then he has the visionary Interior Secretary Stuart Udall for Kennedy and Johnson. I got to give the dedication. I was invited to speak when they named the Interior Department building the Stuart Udall Building in Washington. Udall deserved it. It was bipartisan. We've never had an Interior Secretary like Stuart Udall. The one that comes closest is from Idaho, Cecil Anders, who's one of the greats. I think the three great Interior Secretaries are Udall, Harold Ickes under FDR, and Cecil Andrews, who I hope to write about and talk about at a different occasion. But Kennedy did a lot, and Kennedy was pushing for the Clean Air Act, and when he was shot in Dallas, and all these so-called, I've used the term proto-environmentalist. The term environmental movement is not used that we can find until Ann Arbor in '69 heading into Earth Day. It was still conservation, or we call a proto-environmentalist, a group of people promoting it in the Kennedy years. And everybody worried, these people like Frank Church, Lyndon Johnson. What is he gonna do on the environment? Lyndon loved big dams. Lyndon loved reclamation, scientific irrigation, all great things. But he had no imprint, zero, on caring about national parks and the like. And so there was fear, but everybody begged him to keep Stuart Udall. And the most moving letter I saw was from Ansel Adams. How many of you remember Ansel Adams? Know him? Yeah, good. Ansel Adams, great photographer, and working with the Sierra Club and David Brower, they just were lobbying Johnson, keep Udall, keep Udall. Frank Church lobbying, keep Udall, and Johnson did. And Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson from 1965 until 1969 when they left also are great environmental heroes. It's odd though, because you're watching the Vietnam War, us spraying Agent Orange and killing forest, while, Lyndon's saving wilderness in America with the Wilderness Act or the Wild and Scenic River Act in '68. Lyndon Johnson, a truly flawed president who has these mega accomplishments like the Civil Rights Act and the voting rights, and then saw the albatross of the Vietnam War around his neck. But Johnson had claim to being a cowboy and a rancher because of where he lived in the Texas Hill Country, and he viewed things from a landscape perspective where Jack Kennedy viewed it from the sea, and Frank Church viewed it from the Idaho wilderness and from the Snake River and from a fishing and outdoor recreation culture that Johnson and Kennedy really weren't that familiar with. Out of all of Lyndon Johnson, I hope you all realize national parks, you got to go through Congress. And, so in the Johnson years, Canyonlands in Utah gets approved by Congress as a national park. In 1968, the fiercest fight for any national park I've seen really is Redwood National Park in California. And Johnson got that one done. North Cascades in Oregon National Park. You've noticed Idaho doesn't do a lot with national parks. They like wilderness much more here. And they may have been right in Idaho because you don't have the ticky-tacky kind of tourism. And I think it makes in Idaho a better kind of human sharing with the natural world because you're not feeling wilderness being over-trampled on. Lady Bird Johnson's big campaign was beautification, no ugly billboards, no vulgarity. But the big thing that's occurring in the mid-'60s is what we now call environmental justice. That term's not used till the 1980s, but environmental justice is the notion that we are throwing all of our toxic waste, garbage, dump sites into the neighborhoods of poor people, and particularly Black Americans, Latino Americans, and people of color. And the people that are spoke out as early environmental justice warriors in the 60s, one on top of the list. Cesar Chavez, fighting in Delano with the grape strikes and all for Chavez from Yuma, Arizona, grew up picking fruit, comes from a poor family, served in the U.S. Navy, and now working with people like Frank Church and working with Bobby Kennedy are saying that our people, Mexican Americans, Filipino Americans, are getting sick from these sprays. We're poisoned. Their peoples were having deformities in birth because of it. And Chavez never broke rank with the Catholic Church. He worked through the bishop system, so he never got nailed as a communist by J. Edgar Hoover as much because the church vowed for him. But one of the most beautiful scenes of the 60s is when Bobby Kennedy's breaking his fast, Chavez, and giving him communion before Robert Kennedy was gunned down in Los Angeles. Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., strontium-90 is one of the compounds, chemicals in fallout, nuclear fallout. And King says, what good does it do to sit at an integrated lunch counter if you're drinking milk that has radiation in it? That race can only go so far in life. That maybe something that's above that is humanity, and humanity is shared water and clean air so we can have a healthy planet for all children. Dr. King spoke like that all the time, and some of the new quotes, it's hard to find new quotes on King, really shows how he leaned in this direction. He was an ecological thinker. And he ended up, of course, getting killed in Memphis for the garbage sanitation strike, fighting for the working rights, but also to stop how poor people's neighborhoods were being abused. I don't have to tell you about First People, Indigenous people, how horrific their lives in America were in the 60s, 70s, and beyond into today. But there was a lot of grassroots activism coming out of Indian country, as it used to be called. The Wild and Scenic Rivers is Frank Church again. If I were going to tell you the two great accomplishments of Church, all of you know, but it's worth remembering the Wilderness Act and Wild and Scenic Rivers. I like the Wild and Scenic Rivers the most. The idea that we don't have to have technology to dam every river we see. Even if it's not matter, don't ask about the salmon runs. Just go build because it brings pork to your district. All of our wild rivers were dying. And in the 60s, the Mississippi River was dead. Lake Erie was officially dead. I mean, the Hudson River was contaminated. The Missouri River contaminated. And here is Frank Church saying we've got to save some parts of scenic rivers, and he led the Scenic River Crusade. Again, it is Church. Yes, Walter Mondale helped. And when I said bipartisan, guys, all of these votes are bipartisan. I'm mentioning Church because I'm with you a lot, but John Salyer, Republican from Pennsylvania in Congress, was remarkable there would be nothing without him. And by the time Lyndon Johnson has to abdicate the throne in March of '68, when he says, I'm not running anymore, there was a feeling that the environmentalism might be dead. It wasn't talked about a lot. 68, the conventions, and you see, there wasn't a lot on environmentalism in '68. Edward Abbey wrote an important book on desert solitaire. Paul Ehrlich wrote an important book on population bomb. Stuart Brand, Whole Earth Catalog. Many people, what came to the rescue of the environment by '69, that when Nixon's in the White House, doesn't talk about the environment when he's running in '68, and suddenly everything's environment for that first Earth Day. What happened? On the good news front, oddly, going to the moon. The moonshot brought pictures of lonely, fragile planet Earth, that blue-green, ball hanging there, how lonely we were with no borders. And Walter Cronkite on CBS News started using it as his bumper slide. And it was an ethereal experience to see these first photos of our planet Earth, and it moved people. All the astronauts talked about, they thought they were going to the moon. We've had 12 moonwalkers. And they all came back and said the takeaway wasn't the moon, it was seeing Earth from the moon. The Earthrise, the famous photograph of Bill Anders, one of the astronauts. I got to do the official oral history of Neil Armstrong for NASA. And he was a Purdue University slide rule guy. I mean, total engineer, test pilot, Korean War fighter ace, but he had just this sort of mission type of mentality. And I thought I could loosen up Armstrong. You know, in my big interview with him, I met him at Johnson Space Center. He flew his own plane for the interview. I watched him land. He was kind of a hermit, and we sat, and at one point I felt he was warmed up with me, and I said, Mr. Armstrong, did you ever just look at the moon and think, you know, oh my God, I'm going to be standing there and looking at planet Earth from the moon, from the lunar surface? And he said, no. He was the exception of all the astronauts. Most of them, there was this feeling